Mr. Ismail, with a quick, Mohammed Ismail, the director of Egyptians Abroad for Democracy, with a quick sentences, please, before we go to the questions, because the time is attacking us.
Okay, it's actually to couple comments and question as well. Do you to Mr. Kenneth? First of all, I want to thank you very much for being part of Human Rights Watch, and you guys do a great job for human being in general. You mentioned at the beginning that about who started, what's human rights violation, and things about Hamas and others. But I wanted to ask a couple of questions if you want to take this as a note, and then after that you can answer me later on. What do you consider settlers civilians, the people that they set and take the lands of Palestinians against their own will? Do you consider them civilians or not? And based on your answer, we'll know if the Palestinian or the Palestinian resistance, they deal with civilians or not, or they violate human rights or not. And then, do the Palestinian have the right to resist or no? Or only the Israeli, as we hear from Blinken all the time, they have the right to defend themselves, while the Palestinians don't have the right to resist. At the end, and then the last thing I wanted to say, why do we not put pressure on Egypt? When I say Egypt, I don't mean the people of Egypt, because the people of Egypt here, they're willing to help the people of Palestine. They can do anything possible to help the people of Palestine. But, as you know, from Human Rights Watch, the people of Egypt cannot even demonstrate, cannot even protest. They like to walk to the border and help their brother and sister. According to the international law, Egypt's supposed to be open the gates, not because it's not upon Israel or upon General Sisi to let this happen. Why do we not put pressure on General Sisi? Otherwise, unless if he's part of the conspiracy. I'm not a believer of the conspiracy theory, but I can see it as you heard everyone talking about that we want to displace the people of Gaza to go to Sinai. That making me feel that what's happening is part of the conspiracy to move them on the side of Sinai to end the right of return. I mean, I'm done speaking here. I have other comments to say, but this is enough for what you just mentioned, and I hope you can answer me on that. Thank you very much.
Well,
Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. With the quick questions, Mr. Jimoran, what do you think the actions could the international community take to prevent the systematic actions against civilians in Gaza? What do you think? The mic, please. The mic. Again, yeah. Okay, I'll try to unmute. Okay, now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I don't think the international community is going to do anything of consequence. They're intimidated by the United States and by the general media in Europe and the United States. So I think they're going to stand by and watch this occur and wring their hands in frustration. I appreciate all of the people who are willing to speak out on this call. But I don't have any real any confidence that things are going to change, because Bibi Netanyahu has gotten his will whenever he has chosen to confront the West, regardless of what he has done. I think what they want to do is to relocate virtually the entire Gazan population to someplace in the Sinai, to take over that property. I think it may be that the only thing that's going to stop that is if this conflict if there's a real threat for this conflict to widen. I don't necessarily see that. As long as Saudi Arabia, the Emirates particularly, as long as they continue their policy of throwing the Palestinians under the bus, regardless of what the people on the street, as they say, think about it, nothing's going to happen. The Arab world has to unite. The Muslim world has to unite. I would hope that it would not be in a violent form, but somehow there has to be collective action against what is happening. Otherwise, it goes down in history as not just the Israelis being culpable for this, but the whole world. Accept responsibility for what they're allowing to happen.
So what are the obstacles to recognize and responding to these acts as genocide on a global scale, and how can they be overcome? Like, if I ask Mr. Jonathan Purcell, what would you say?
Could you repeat that question, please?
What are the obstacles to recognizing and responding to these acts as genocide on a global scale?
I think we haven't even got anywhere near that so far. Before we even get there, there's so many initial things that international actors have to recognize. Haven't got past calling for a ceasefire instead of a humanitarian pause, for instance. I mean, surely that is the very, very first step that needs to take place. But if we're talking about legal terminology, which includes but is not restricted to genocide, then it's clear that the political appetite amongst many in the international community is not there. And therefore, legal channels are something that, you know, needs to be considered by activists and change makers outside of the political elite in certain countries. So I won't speak directly on genocide in this particular example, just because it's not something that has taken place yet in a legal capacity. But to give an example of what ICJP, my organization, has done, is put a notice of intention to prosecute UK politicians for their role in aiding and abetting war crimes and crimes against humanity. As cases build, other international crimes can be considered also. But I think that this legal challenge is quite an important route. Under the Rome Statutes, it doesn't simply have to be Israeli politicians who are directly conducting these war crimes. The aiding and abetting of war crimes by the complicity of international actors can in turn result in their own complicity. So that is quite an interesting space that can be considered if there is continued reluctance from the global international community, which sadly, as it stands, seems to be continuing.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Ken Roth, I was going to ask you to answer some questions that appears from Mr. Muhammad.
I'd be happy to do that.
When he was asking about, do we consider like what is civilians and these settlers, and it's kind of framing it also inside the media, like is it what happened is resistance or not? So all these questions. Yes, sir.
Okay. I mean, first on the resistance question, I mean, obviously there's, both sides can claim, a right to military action. The Palestinians to resist occupation, the Israelis to resist violent attack. As I say, none of that matters with respect to the duty by both sides to comply with international humanitarian law. With respect to the settlers, the settlements themselves are violations of humanitarian law. They're actually war crimes. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits an occupying power from transferring its population to occupied territory. So that's what the settlements are. So that's a clear grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. It's a war crime. That doesn't make the settlers themselves into legitimate targets or combatants. Most settlers are just civilians who are living there. They're, you could say they shouldn't live there because they were part of this transfer, but there's nothing in there that makes them legitimate military targets. They are protected civilians. The only exception to that would be settlers who take up arms and who, in a sense, become, a part of the Israeli Defense Forces or, an informal militia. But leaving aside that narrow category of people, the settlers personally cannot be attacked. It's a war crime to attack them. Now, with respect to Egypt, you're absolutely right. We should be pressuring the Egyptian government. The Egyptian government has been a critical partner of the Israeli government in enforcing the blockade for 16 years, and now in enforcing the siege. And so we tend to say, oh, the Israeli government is doing this. That's actually a mistake. It's the Israeli government and the Egyptian government working together that are imposing these conditions on Gaza. If the Egyptian government was not doing that, there would not be, a blockade of Gaza. There would be, free economic development, or much freer at least. So we should, put blame on Sisi. And indeed, he is very opposed to Hamas. I mean, not just because of Hamas's resort to violent attacks on civilians, but also because Hamas, is a more violent branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which in Egypt, as we remember, was the party that, Morsi used to win the only free and fair election Egypt has had. And, Sisi is terrified of the Muslim Brotherhood and has done everything he could to crush it domestically. So, the same Sisi who oversaw the slaughter of 817 Muslim Brotherhood sit-in protesters in Rabbah Square is the one who is, backing the Israeli government now as it, bombs Palestinian civilians.
Mr. Kenroth, here the election brought me back to the point where Hamas won the election in 2006, and it was faced by this blockade by the West, not recognizing even the most fresh democratic in Palestine. So what do you think about that?
Well, Hamas won the election in 2006. I mean, I think both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority are rightfully criticized for refusing to ever have another election again. Hamas has turned into a military dictatorship in Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority is terrified of an election because they're afraid that they would lose. And so you've got this, increasingly elderly, corrupt body that has effectively become a subcontractor of the Israeli government, that has, very little legitimacy left. This was, of course, by design of the Israeli government. I mean, Netanyahu has been quite open about, liking the fact that Hamas was dominant, because Hamas was never seen as a potential partner in peace negotiations. He liked the fact that the Palestinian Authority was totally discredited and weak, because it would, therefore nobody would be there to negotiate a two-state solution, which gradually has died as the settlements have expanded. And indeed, the settlement expansion has added to the discrediting among many Palestinians of the Palestinian Authority. So there, are two leading bodies, neither of which is much of a partner for negotiating peace, which was just what Netanyahu wanted, because he wanted to keep the occupation in perpetuity. And it was that, endless occupation, the lack of any prospect of a peace process, that led Human Rights Watch to say that, this oppressive discrimination that we found in the occupied territory wasn't just a passing phenomenon that would be resolved through this, endless and really non-existent peace process, but it was rather apartheid.
Hey, can I just say something here, please, if you don't mind, to Canis as well? I just, what leverage, this is a couple of things. What leverage do we have on Egypt or on Sisi to make him, we don't want to just blame him, but what leverage we have? Mm-hmm. This is number one. The second thing, you talk about the sit-in and Rabbah Square. I was there. I'm not Muslim Brotherhood. I'm actually against Muslim Brotherhood, but not all of them Muslim Brotherhood, the one they were killed or smashed as well. Mm-hmm. So this is the two things I just wanted to highlight. So go for it, please. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, sure. I mean, just in terms of your point, what leverage? I mean, the U.S. gives Egypt, $1.3 billion in military aid every year. Biden, 235 million of that is explicitly by legislation conditioned on certain, human rights practices. The Sisi government failed those miserably, and Biden just let the money go through anyhow. And Sisi has been very adept at saying, don't push me on my repression, because I'm helping Israel maintain the blockade and now the siege. So let me go with my repression. And, Biden has fallen for that. European governments, it's a slightly different calculation. Sisi says, I'll keep migrants away from the Mediterranean, just keep my money coming. And so Sisi, in this very cynical way, has learned how to play Western governments to downplay his repression in return for things that they want. And how do we put pressure on Sisi? The best way is to put pressure on Western governments and just show the hypocrisy behind their ongoing support for what is really the most repressive, brutal government in Egypt's modern history.
So would that mean that we don't really have leverage?
It's
What
so
we
slight.
have is just the pressure of the people. Yeah, I mean, it's important to have this kind of dialogue because Kenneth is an important person to be. I mean, everybody's important, but he's at the head of Human Rights Watch, and he has a direct, like, he's hands-on in Egypt, he's hands-on in Palestine. So it's an opportunity for us
Let
to
me highlight this. Hello.
Yes, Mr. Muhammad Jamil.
I don't want to go and academic discussion or technical issues. This need the civilian shields, the classification of the factions in Palestine. Let me stress that the majority of the Israelis are armed, not civilians. 350,000 reserves called to this war. Who are these? They are settlers, they are citizens, they are so what is the stand of the international law here? Ben Gvir, when this war start, he distribute arms to all settlers, and before that we see the settlers how they attack the Palestinians, how they burn Hawara, killed people, attack them in the day and night. There is a lot of questions here about big question mark about the self-defense, the reaction of the occupation. Is the occupation until now after 60 years have the right of this defense? This is a question must be answered now by the International Justice Court. There is a case in front of it and must be answered in front of special ad hoc court must formed to look at all crimes. I'm not worried about this, and we will have clear answers about the position of these crimes committed by the settlers, the army, everyone in this regime.
Mr. Muhammad, I would like to pass this question.
I want to stress something very clearly. The Palestinians have all the right. If there is a lot of questions on the rights of the occupation in the international law. But in the international law, there is no questions whatsoever that the Palestinians have the right to self-defense, have the right to resist.
Okay. Alicia, what do you think? I would like to pass part of these questions to you.
Just to kind of echo what the other folks were saying, the settlers are civilians, but they are there illegally. So, like I said previously, not to justify any kind of violence towards them, if they shouldn't be there in the first place. So that's part of the ongoing problem, is having the occupation in place and allowing the settlers to move into the Palestinian land. I mean, that's not if we allow that to continue to happen, then we're not going to get to a place where anybody's going to find peace. And I know that that there's parts of the Jewish community that are living in Israel proper that they understand that the occupation is part of the ongoing problem, and they don't support the government's continued support of allowing the settlements to take place and the occupation to keep happening. So I mean, it doesn't benefit anybody, because the violence will continue as long as the blockade is still in place on the Gaza Strip and the occupation is in place for the occupied West Bank.
Yes, I see this. if the United Nations, decisions has been followed accurately, there will not be settlements. They were all illegal settlements in West Bank. And so, Mr. Adam Shapiro, you still with us?
Yes.
So, do you think what are the long-term implications for international human rights? The situation in Gaza remains unaddressed by global powers. If you want to
I mean, it's hard to say about the long-term
implications. You have the right to comment if you want and answer the question.
Just in terms of the other questions, I think, what's being mixed up here to some extent is what is permissible under international humanitarian law versus what is the political sort of position of different groups and how they carry out their attacks and what tactics they use. The first about international humanitarian law, who's a civilian, who's not a civilian, who's a legitimate target, who's not a legitimate target, all of those things are fairly well clearly laid out and represent the limitation of international law, frankly, because we also have to understand the context in which these laws were written at the time, who wrote them, and what interest they also represented at the time. And that's a whole different theoretical approach. Just I would only contextualize what the attack on October 7th was to some extent before laying all the blame on Hamas for its attacks. We still don't know who crossed the border, who was under the command of Hamas in terms of the actions that they carried out and who wasn't. And we also don't, and just because Hamas initiated the attack doesn't necessarily mean it as an entity is responsible for everything that occurred subsequently. So there's still a lot of gray area and question marks that have to be investigated. Furthermore, I would also add, because I think the word settlement has now been used at least in two different contexts, one to represent the target of the attacks on October 7th and some other, and again, to represent the settlements in the West Bank. And there is a genuine, legitimate, at least one pathway to argue that the kibbutzes that were attacked were indeed settlements, in part because they were located in lands that Israel annexed subsequent to the 1949 armistice, what's called the Gaza envelope. And furthermore, Israel located military bases either in or adjacent to the settlements in some ways, which could be argued, and I have seen at least one or two legal scholars arguing this, that in effect is Israel's use of what's often Hamas gets accused of using human shields, civilian shields, that Israel's tactic, and this exists throughout the land of Israel and Palestine, Israel places military bases in civilian locations. And it does so in this is true in the north, this is true in the West Bank, in order to basically combine military and civilian into one effective area. So there are still questions that can be asked about this, and there are questions that lawyers can debate and get into. In terms of the future, for Gaza, in terms of human rights and Palestine in general, I would, the question was asked, what can the international community do? And I agree about the skepticism that's been, expressed so far. However, I do think there might be a couple of spaces where action could be taken with the right kind of pressure that wouldn't necessarily cost states too much in terms of what they'd be willing to risk in order to make it happen. One is, and somebody mentioned the International Criminal Court, and while the investigation into what's currently happening is something that is potentially ongoing and needs to happen, there has been sufficient evidence already presented to the court by the United Nations about another incident that happened in Gaza called the Gaza March of Return, the Great March of Return, in which thousands of people were injured, hundreds were killed, in what has been well documented as explicit orders to shoot to kill against civilians, protected civilians. This is a case that the prosecutor could act on now. And I believe that state pressure addressing that could be effective for two reasons. One, it changes the narrative somewhat about Palestinian resistance, about the idea that Palestinians are only violent, that the Palestinians have never tried to be, peaceful, peaceful resistance, etc. And some of the same potential perpetrators from the Gaza March of Return, from the Israeli side, people who were in command positions, are also now in command positions vis-a-vis what's happening in Gaza right now. So there is a potential utility in pursuing justice and accountability for something that happened previously in terms of affecting behavior potentially now and changing the narrative around this entirely. That, getting the ICC prosecutor to act on the Palestine file has been obviously very difficult up until now. However, we know from talking to people and from hearing, what we're hearing, that just as there have been cracks and dissent inside the US administration and the bureaucracy, in the State Department and in the US Embassy in Jerusalem and other places, Defense Department, where people who work in these institutions are now directly and not quite publicly, but it's being publicly reported, dissenting with the administration leadership. And that's causing an internal pressure that has been unprecedented, really, in a lot of ways, at least maybe since the days of Vietnam in the United States. Similarly, we're hearing that in the ICC, people who are working in the office of the prosecutor and in the court system are very disgruntled and unhappy with the way the prosecutor has handled the Palestine file up until now. And that has only escalated as a result of what's happening recently. So there is potentially pressure that could be leveraged to move something forward in terms of accountability, which wouldn't be, it wouldn't be insignificant. It wouldn't stop what's happening now, but it wouldn't be insignificant. And then the second thing also, and this gets to the question about the future of human rights. Prior to all of this happening, there's been interest in South Africa and some other countries to restart the UN's Office on Apartheid, Committee on Apartheid, and to focus, to establish it generally, but obviously the situation of Israel, thanks in part to the reports that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and Israeli organizations and Palestinian organizations have put out about apartheid, that this, I think the opportunity space for that to be renewed and for states to go ahead and authorize that through the General Assembly, I think that the chances of actually now are much higher than they were before. And that also wouldn't be insignificant. Again, it wouldn't stop what's happening right now, but in terms of the longer term is quite a useful thing, I think, to happen.